Croptalk on Market Journal is supported by Nebraska soybean farmers and their checkoff.
And finally today, we're taking a look back at the 2024 growing season and looking ahead to what's to come for 2025 for soybean producers this week for our Crop Talk segment. Earlier this week, Market Journal's Mike Straub caught up with Extension plant pathologist Dylan Mangel to learn what diseases soybean producers should be watching for this year.
With planting season quickly emerging, considering last season's soybean diseases and preparing for this year's crops, disease management and soil testing should be top priority in hopes of avoiding yield loss due to disease this year.
So for soybean production in 2024, we sort of had the standard big challenges like sudden death syndrome and soybean cyst nematode. A lot of growers had questions about those and how they can deal with those and manage those. And they're also thinking about soil testing this time of year. They can still get that done. So the Nebraska Soybean Board is still supporting free soil testing for any Nebraska grower to see if they have soybean cyst nematode in their fields. It's important to figure out if you have soybean cyst nematode in the field, but it's also important to follow up and test again to make sure that management is working. Unfortunately, this parasite can cause significant yield loss with no noticeable symptoms. So monitoring those population levels is the only way you can really tell how well it's being managed. As we gear up for planting season, a lot of growers probably decided on their varieties already, but there might be some leeway in there. So just take another chance, look back at those field histories and make sure that the varieties you've placed in those fields, they've got good tolerance and resistance ratings for the diseases that you've had in those fields in the past. Specific diseases, think about soybean cyst nematode. That's an important one when it comes to resistance genes. So select something that has PI88788 as a resistance source, or a new one called peaking that's done quite well. Another big problem in the past that these upcoming fields are going to have might be white mold. So if you had white mold bad in 2023, pick a variety with good resistance for white mold.
When thinking about white mold, it's beneficial to know that it will overwinter in cornfields and show up again in soybeans after rotation. Over-irrigation can also be a main cause of white mold in soybeans.
It not only overwinters, but it'll last several years. So we had bad white mold in Nebraska in 2021 and again in 2023. So if you think about it, those are the same fields if you're on a corn-soybean rotation. They were bad, they rotated to corn, that's not a host, and then back to beans. The problem is in 2024 we were corn again, and in 2025 we're going to rotate back to beans on those fields. So the inoculum is still there, especially if you've had it bad in both of those years. That inoculum that's going to start that infection is still there, so think about that coming up. And try to get ahead on making some of those fungicide decisions. I'd say the biggest predictor for if you're going to deal with white mold again is if you had it those last two cycles that you had soybeans in those fields. So think about those fields as where you want to focus your management when it comes to white mold. Especially for white mold, a big driver is irrigation. So the first places I saw it this year were soybean fields or soybean borders around seed corn fields. The reason it's showing up there is because that's a perfect example of over-irrigation on those beans, because the corn is what really needs it and what's driving those decisions. But think about that as an example. When you get excessive irrigation on soybeans, that's when white mold's really going to flare up. That could be in weird cases like soybean borders, but also in your own full soybean fields. Think about making sure you're not over-irrigating and thinking about putting that water on when it's needed. So not too early. Not too early if your soils can hold it. The same thing that Tamara Jackson-Zim stated, though, about disease pressure being potentially worse in the middle of that center pivot. That could work out as well in soybean production. The pivot's just moving slower, putting out water slower in the center than it is at the faster moving tip of that pivot. So you're going to have leaves stay wetter longer in that center. So when you think about scouting, maybe follow that pivot row down and try scouting the middle of that field.
If heavy rain or several days of overcast skies are in the forecast, getting ahead of that weather pattern with foliar fungicide applications will be beneficial in combating white mold in soybeans.
So you're more dependent on the environment. Think about weather patterns when you're going to get that rain. For white mold specifically, the plant is most susceptible during the peak of that flowering, during the peak of that soybean flowering. So if you've got strong weather patterns coming through that are going to leave overcast skies, a lot of rain for several days, think about, if the plants are susceptible, making those foliar fungicide applications leading into an event like that, just so you can get ahead of it. So when you're getting into the growing season and you start to see some issues, the first thing you really got to do is make sure you've taken the time to identify what disease you're dealing with specifically. Management is always going to be disease specific. And in some cases, you can make management decisions in the season, like foliar fungi. You might be able to get out there and put on a foliar fungicide quickly. But in a lot of cases, especially when it comes to seedling diseases like we might see early in the spring, making good notes, figuring out where those pathogens are in your field, it's not going to save you this season, but next time you rotate around, you can place appropriate seed treatments in those areas. Just get ready for the spring. Think about those seedling diseases as we get into that early season. Scout for those and then figure out which seedling diseases you're dealing with, because they're actually quite different. Even though a lot of the symptoms look the same, it might impact your seed treatment management decisions in the future.
Disease management is always going to be disease specific. Scouting and identifying seedling diseases will help with seed management decisions in the future. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Mike Straub.